Hello, and welcome to our session today, hosted by the Kixis Group and SQL Perform North America. Today our session focuses on scenarios that have impacted many of the largest deployments of NAV and many of our customers here in North America. We're here to help you overcome the challenge of large and increasingly expanding database volumes. Our SQL Perform team has a number of tools we can use to help with NAV performance, and today my colleague Floyd Chan will be showcasing our SQL Perform archiving and compression tools, as well as the process we go through to address the reduction in NAV production databases while preserving and maintaining data history. Floyd, please take us away.
And welcome everybody. I appreciate everybody making some time out in order to learn a little bit about data archiving and compression for NAV and Business Central for that matter. And we'll talk a little bit about the tool sets that we have and the services around those tools in order to help minimize the amount of impact that data can have on performance. And we'll talk a little bit about that throughout the hour, and also to look at a few different ways of approaching performance and archiving, especially data volume. So on that note, let's get going. So let's talk a little bit about SQL Perform. The original founder and our current founder is still the same guy. His name's Hynek Mulbacher. So I'm going to spend a moment talking about Hynek and introduce everybody to who he is and why is it important. Hynek was one of the original developers of Navision back in the day when it was owned by the Danish company out of Copenhagen. Hynek started working for Navision back in 1993. And when Microsoft became a possible acquirer of Navision back, as you all know now, around 2001-ish, Hynek was one of the employees who became a Microsoft employee. But prior to that transition, internally, Navision wanted to move from their old Seaside database, their own proprietary database, to SQL Server, because Microsoft runs on SQL Server, and to make Navision a better acquisition target for Microsoft, Navision knew that they needed to add this option as a database engine. Internally, Hynek was one of the go-to guys for SQL Server and how the application was going to communicate with SQL Server. So Hynek was one of the key guys around that transition time period, and also once Microsoft acquired Navision, Hynek continued being a Microsoft employee, continuing to work with Navision and product development and SQL Server. In 2003, Hynek decided to take his tools and methodologies and start up SQL Perform and offer it to partners and customers worldwide in order to get better behavior out of your Navision system. So there's a bunch of tools and services that SQL Perform provides, and over the years, SQL Perform has grown. As you can see, we have offices now in not only United Kingdom, where Hynek's based out of, but Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, and we represent North America. These are, in sum total, some of the largest market shares for Microsoft for the NAV product, and some of the biggest installs of the product exist in these regions. SQL Perform also provides services to Microsoft in terms of product development and around performance. In fact, in the NAV 5.0 version, for example, our organization was deeply involved with helping Microsoft resolve performance issues as part of product development. In any case, we have deep roots with Microsoft and the product team and how the performance behavior works. Me, Floyd, I've been working with NAV for 20 years, and it was around 2006 Hynek and I crossed paths, and we got talking about performance and discovered that we were doing a lot of things that were very similar, and Hynek had asked me to represent the tools and methodologies in the North American market. So that's how I came to be working with this product and company. So let's take a quick look here. A number of different SQL Perform clients. These are primarily based out of Europe, but we also have quite a few in North America. I really should probably update a few of these. Once again, in North America, if we were to say out of the top 100 clients by database size and probably by seat count, we've probably had input into probably at least 25 to 30% of those client installs in terms of performance and helping partners and customers out with improving their systems. So today we're going to focus on data and data volume and what could that mean in terms of performance. So let's talk a little bit now about data lifecycle. And it doesn't matter if we're actually talking about NAV or any other system. Could be ERP, could be any system for that matter, but specifically ERP. And again, not necessarily NAV, but any system that requires data. So what phases does the data move through? So typically we would start off by creating the data, right? So some sort of master record perhaps, lookup data perhaps. And after you've created the data, then you would use it and you would pull it into day-to-day transactions as part of documents, for example, sales orders, purchase orders, or all sorts of different kinds of operational transactions. And once you've posted that transaction through and it lands in the ledger tables and it lives as history, then you're going to need that data in order to pull it back out for reporting, analysis, and potentially also for other kinds of transactions like paying your taxes, for example. So you do need it for further transactional reference. After a period of time, though, that data becomes potentially less and less important, but you still might need to keep it around for legal reasons and other kinds of compliance. In some countries, for example, you might need that data for up to 10 years. In Canada, where I'm based out of, the data set here needs to be maintained for 7 years, etc. So it depends on where you are in the world and how important it is. And also there might be other reasons why you might want to keep some data. Now, depending on the system, and in general, when it comes to ERP, you probably don't want to delete data. Okay, so in general, it's probably not a good idea because quite often you lose references as you do reporting in the future, or you want to dig back into some details. If you delete the data, it's gone. But in general, talking about systems and data, you probably get to a point where you might want to discard the data because it's no longer useful, and therefore discarding the data is a typical step in the process. Although usually, as I said, in ERP, it's not something that you would normally do. This is also part of the reason why in the world of NAV and Business Central, so I will use those terms interchangeably. And so if I say Business Central, I mean NAV, and if I say NAV, I mean Business Central. The two are synonymous, and they're essentially the same product. Business Central is the rebranded version of what used to be called Dynamics NAV. As it stands now with most implementations, the systems have started up a certain way. You've gone and you've deployed it based on many assumptions and configured your hardware and software a certain way. And over time, your data systems have grown, and therefore you may now be in a situation where you have a large volume of data, right? And what might I consider a large volume of data? Let's say anywhere over 100 or 200 gigs in size in database. Some clients actually even smaller than that can consider using the archiving tool. But in any case, these databases will continue to grow without any sort of other approach in terms of what do you want to do with your data. Now, we should talk a little bit about performance and what does this mean. So In a good system, when it comes to data and data retrieval, if code has been written efficiently and transactions and different processes have been designed efficiently, what should happen is when it goes out to get the data that it needs in order to do a certain transaction, the set of data should be very small based on filters and indexes and all sorts of other things. However, this isn't always true. Quite often in customization and also even in the base product in certain areas, there are processes that are inefficient. So it will go out and get large sets of data, which is not good, but that is quite often just simply how the application wants to work. And therefore, if you have all your data in a certain area that's needed in a process, and it's going and grabbing large sets of data, it will take a very long time to process that data, whether to report on it or process it or whatever the case may be. Okay, so large sets of records can add overhead to areas of the application, especially around customization, one, and in even, as I said, in some base areas of the product, there could be overhead introduced. Now, having said that, over time, your database grows, the volume of data grows, and therefore performance can start to drop because of volume size. Now, I will say in the base product, in NAV and now Business Central, there is already a built-in archiving tool. Okay, so I do want to call it out so that everyone here is aware that that does exist in the product. All right, so what does that do? Well, I should talk about that a little bit. So first of all, that was introduced a long, long time ago, probably about at this point 15 or 20 years ago. So it's been around for quite a while, actually. Now, the archiving tool that comes out of base NAV, what it will do is it will go to your ledger tables, and basically what it will do is take the data for a period of time and essentially do a pivot. So hopefully everybody here is familiar with the idea of pivot tables in Excel. Basically what it does is takes that data and consolidates it into certain perspectives to come up with a compressed record. And that compressed record by default usually is out of the base product by posting date. So it's usually by some sort of fiscal period, and usually by global 1 and or global 2. And that's usually the extent of the compression out of the box. Now, having said that, when it was first introduced about 15 or 20 years ago, the product actually didn't work well. There were actually a lot of bugs in it, and there was a lot of problems when it was first deployed. And I will say that likely Microsoft over the last 15 or 20 years has probably fixed some of those problems, if not all of them. However, I, like a lot of other partners who've used the tool 15 or 20 years ago, have been very gun shy in terms of using it again, just simply because of it not working well in the past, and because it did cause problems in the past. Very few people that I know of have actually continued to use it. But I do want to say it's there if you want to use it. But it does have its disadvantages. One of the disadvantages with using the compression tool out of the box is it will only compress based on those primary factors that I talked about: posting date, global 1, global 2, right? Think about now, for example, if let's say you have customization in your GL entry table. You have some sort of custom field, and maybe that custom field is also needed in order to do aggregate reporting. Maybe you have a BI tool or external reporting. The thing is, if you do out-of-the-box compression, you will lose the data in those custom fields. It'll just simply be compressed out because the out-of-the-box tools are not aware of any form of customization or any other field that you might need, even in the base product, that you might want to include as part of compression. Okay, so that's one problem. The other major problem with out-of-the-box compression is that once it is compressed, is the original source records are deleted. Okay, so hopefully if prior to you doing this process, you've made a backup, full backup of the database, and then if you needed it, you would have to go and restore your backup, and then at some point go into this backup database and perhaps mine your detailed records if you needed it. Okay, what I'm about to show you is a tool set that SQL Perform has created. Heenek created this over many years, knowing that some of these problems existed with the base product, having worked as a developer inside Navision. And he developed this over several years and perfected it. And what we did was we deployed this originally in Europe over, I would say, probably first released about 6 or 7 years ago. We've done many projects in Europe. And then about 4 years ago, I implemented the very first version of the tool set here in North America. In that scenario, the very first client that I tried this on, just to give everybody a point of view, was for a very large North American retailer. And in that scenario, they had a 1.3 terabyte database. So that was 1.3 terabytes. And after we did our archiving and compression, they went down to 700 gigs. So we basically eliminated 600 gigs worth of data. And their system stayed completely correct from a financial accounting perspective. Even though we had compressed records, everything balanced, and we kept all of the data compressed in such a way that all of their reporting needs were met for historical data, so that if they, for example, let's say we had compressed their item ledger entry, but they wanted to retain aggregates by location code, we maintained all that so that all their historical reporting would still work, even though we compressed all of their history around item ledger entry. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about these kinds of scenarios, and also what you'll see in a moment I'll talk about is all of that original data was not lost. Okay, so in fact, at any point, if they want to report on detail, they still had access to it. So on that note, let's move over and let's talk about the actual tools and how do they work. Okay, so before we get into the tools, let's talk a little bit about some of the criteria that we had for ourselves. Heenek stated that these had to be met in order for us to be able to finally go to market with the tools. So he set these up as rules about 10 years ago when he was first starting the product development. So first of all, the data is never deleted. The original data is still there. So you might be wondering, how do we do this? You'll see in a moment what we actually do is your production database is the one that will get compressed, but what we will actually do is set up a parallel database, SQL Server database, which we call the archive database. So what you'll see is that we actually move data from your production environment over to the archive database, and then we create the compressed records in production. This is why the original data is never deleted. In fact, in a moment, I will even tell you something that's really interesting as to how we move the data, and you'll see in a moment, we'll have the ability to move it back. Okay. The other part is that our archiving and compression tools will work with any NAV table. Again, unlike the base out-of-the-box compression tool, we will work with any base NAV table. We will also be able to work with any customization or third-party ISV product. Basically, all we have to do is configure the tools to point to the right table and define how you want to archive and compress the data. And it's actually as simple as that. Data consistency. In doing an archive or compression, if there is any form of failure while that occurs, the data stays completely consistent. It's basically, it works or it doesn't work. Okay, so basically, at any point, if there's an error for whatever reason during production, it will just simply roll back. And at that point, we could investigate further. But after our typical test phase for our clients, we actually have not had a client come back ever saying to us that in production that they've had a data failure. The other part of this is Also, unlike the base NAV compression tools, all of our functions run on SQL Server. Okay, so our functions are not written in Cal code running inside NAV. We actually run on SQL Server. So because it runs on SQL Server, this means it runs much faster than running inside Cal code and inside the NAV client. Okay. Now, having said that, one of the things I will call out right now, and that is, if you are running Business Central, our tools will only work with Business Central on-premise. As long as we have access to the SQL Server in the middle tier, so some people are running web versions of Business Central, but they still maintain the infrastructure, so perhaps they're hosted or they have their own VM hosted machines around SQL Server in the middle tier. As long as we have access to the SQL Server, our tools can be installed and it can be run. Right now, we don't support the pure SaaS version of Business Central, only because in that scenario, SQL Server, as of today, doesn't expose SQL Server. Having said that, my belief that in the future, Microsoft might provide access to SQL Server as bigger and bigger clients move to the full SaaS model on Azure. Okay, but most of the clients right now who are running on Azure are fairly small. There's not that many clients who run a large scenario on SaaS. However, if you are, then again, there are other tools and other approaches as well. And if you have questions around that, we can talk about that later. The power of undo. So because we talked about archiving and compression, I'm going to define what archiving and compression is in a moment. And because we can archive and compress, we also have tools to de-archive and decompress, again, unlike the out-of-the-box tools. We also have the ability to fully handle dimensions. So even though you're archiving and compressing, I mentioned that out of the box, you can do global 1 and 2. We can do as many dimensions as you want. And on top of that, any other fields that you might want to include as part of how to aggregate the data and how you might want to report on it afterwards. Our tools will also handle any related tables. So for example, if you choose to archive posted sales invoices or posted purchase invoices, you can define in our tool that you want to archive those particular tables. And by defining those tables, it knows when you point to the purchase header or sales header, it knows that you also meant the lines, the comments, the dimensions, and any other related tables. Okay, so quite a few tables that all want to archive. Out of the box, we already know all the relationships and we move all the related data as well. For custom areas, we might have to further define additional relationships. But again, what you'll see in a moment is this is all done through configuration. So that's also kind of cool. As you are archiving and compressing the data, just like standard NAV, we have register tables. So register tables in NAV track who posted what when, okay, for audit trail purposes. So if you look at, for example, any GL postings, there's a GL register. We have our archiving and compression registers. So therefore, you can also go back and see who archived and who compressed when. Okay, and data visibility. So as I mentioned already, since we have a separate database with all the detail, you can see it, report on it, access it at any time. All right, so these were the rules. And yes, we met all the rules. So now let's talk about the actual tool sets. All right, so actually up till very recently, we had 3 tools. We're actually deprecating one of these 3 tools. So let me go in order of size of tool and complexity. The smallest tool and the one that we're deprecating is one that we're calling Perform Data Port. The Perform Data Port tool, as you'll see in a moment, actually, why don't I jump to that screen? The Perform Data Port tool, what it does is it basically copies data from your choice of an NAV company or table or set of related tables, and you can then move and copy that data to another company or database. And this can include dimensions or linked tables. The reason why we're deprecating this tool is Microsoft has finally decided to implement this within the core product, I believe starting in NAV 2016 or 17, right? So if your version of NAV is prior to that, you still may want to potentially get this tool if you need to, for example, do data movement, data synchronization. This could be a really simple way to move specific data from one set of database and or company to another database and or company. Okay, but as I said, we're deprecating it as far as all new installs are concerned, just because base product has started to implement some of the things that we had already built. In any case, so that's Perform Data Port. Let's now talk about archiving. So what is archiving? So specifically, this is all about moving data, right? And specifically, you would define from a specific NAV table or perhaps related tables like header and lines, okay? And what you would do is then define from where, and then you would point to where. And in this case, it would move it to the archive database. The best kind of data to think about when it comes to archiving is transaction documents, okay, for example, or any other kind of historical data that is not a ledger. Okay, so there might be other kinds of data sets that build up over time, and you just simply want to move it. And then after you move it, typically what you want to do is delete it from your live database. Okay, so we trim it out, okay, and it's gone from your live database, but it lives in the archive database. And as you can see, it includes the ability to move any sort of linked tables like dimensions or any other kinds of tables. And because we have this ability now that we track through the register what got moved by whom and when, you could actually de-archive. So basically all that does is takes the data that's now in the archive database and simply moves it back into production. Okay, so it's a simple movement from one side to the other and deletes it out of, in this case, from your live database. Let's move on from the archive tool, and now let's talk about compression. So very much like archive, what we can now do is move data from specific tables, and typically these are ledger and subledger tables. And once again, moves it to the archive database, but not only does it delete the records out of live, it also creates compressed entries. Okay, so instead of having a million records potentially in your ledger and subledger, as an example, it may compress it to a few dozen records based on, again, your choice of how you want to compress by. And that's really one of the key things that I want everybody to understand is you can configure how you want to compress these records by. Okay, so as I already mentioned, usually it's probably by fiscal period, and then in our case could be by any combination of your choice of dimensions or any other field that exists in the table. Okay, and now because we have taken this data, moved it into the archive database, deleted the records out of production, and inserted compressed entries. Actually, let me tell you a little bit about how that works, actually, because now this is where it gets really neat, and this is going to speak probably to the more technical people who might be on this call. Anybody who has ever looked at NAV ledger tables, if you ever looked, you'll notice that the primary key is a field called entry number. And by default, NAV starts with the number 1. And for every new ledger record that gets created, it just simply gives it the next entry number. Okay, and that's fine. Then that's how NAV works. Okay, but here's what's interesting. That field called entry number is an integer field, right? Okay, and if you think about it, it starts with the number 1, which is fine. But one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that integer field allows you to put a value in that field from -2 billion to +2 billion. Okay, so yeah, there is a limit of records that you can put into the ledger table. Nobody's ever hit the 2 billion limit, in case you're worried. But in any case, it's quite a large number, bigger than you might think. In any case, so why is this interesting? Well, let's talk about a scenario. So let's say you want to compress your GL entries. And let's just say you only want to keep records from January 1st, 2016 forward. Okay. Anything prior to January 1st, 2016, you want to compress. And let's just say there's 2 million records prior to January 1st, 2016. So what our tool does is basically finds those first 2 million records up to basically December 31st, 2015 in this case. And what it does is it copies all those records over the archive database. And now what it does is that it will delete those records 1 through 2 million, entry number 1 through 2 million, from your production database. And then what it will do is create the compressed records to represent, the aggregated values back into the production database. But for each one of these compressed records, what we do is we actually start writing from the -2 billion range forward. So all of our compressed records start at -2 billion. So why is this interesting? It's because if you want to decompress, the way it works is you pick that compressed record in the 2 billion range. Because we have that register record that knows what are the detailed records that made up that compressed record. When you decompress, it will delete that compressed record out of that -2 billion range. It will go into the archive database, find the original source records, and it will just simply move them back into their original positions. Think about those entry numbers. They never changed. That's actually really cool if you think about it. Okay, so that's how we basically do our decompress, if anybody's interested. Also in the compression tool, the compression tool comes in 2 levels. There's also a secondary level to the compression, which includes open item entries and how to calculate them. Later, when we talk about how we approach a compression projects, you'll see that typically we do it in phases. And often in the first project in doing a compression, we usually don't compress the item ledger entries. The reason is because often we find that clients haven't gone through and properly closed out all of their item ledger entries. Now, if you have, great, then we can include it as part of the project. Often what we find is because item ledger entries are not closed yet and not closed properly, is that there's a large number of open item ledger entries. And therefore, when we calculate how much we can compress the item ledger entries, it's not a lot, right? Because when it comes to compression, our tools only work on closed entries. Anytime there's an open entries, we do not touch it. Okay, we only touch closed entries, basically entries that are done. Okay, so this is usually what we do is as part of our project phase is we'll show clients what item entries are still needing to be closed. And then as a second wave, quite often customers will go back, close all the item entries properly, and then rerun the tools, and at that point, get even more compression out of item ledger entries. But as I said, if you've managed to adjust costs properly and do it on a frequent basis, then you might be able to compress your item ledger entries as part of the first phase. In any case, it's an option. So let's now talk a little bit about how do we now approach archiving. So we talked a little bit about the fact that we have 2 archive databases, or sorry, 2 databases, one live and now this archive database. So what typically happens now is you will take the tools and inside SQL Server configure them. We would help you do that. And once they're all configured and ready to go, you will run it the first time. Okay, and this is assuming that we've gone through all the testing phase and all that. So this is all about when you're ready to now apply it to production for the first time. Once you run it the first time, so on day 0, it will take the data, move it from live, and move it over to archive. At the end of year 1, typically most people run our tools on a fiscal year process or basis, but you could run this as frequently as you want. It's up to you. It depends on how often do you want to archive your data. you can just simply rerun our tools. The big assumption here is that the table structure on live and archive has not changed. Okay, so assuming that the two sides are exactly the same, then you can just simply rerun the tools. And again, it will just simply take data out of the live database and move it over to archive. And again, at the end of year 2, you can just continue to do the same. If you're wondering, well, what if I do have a change in my data and structure? You just simply have to apply the table changes over to the archive database as well. And you might have to revisit and reconfigure the tools if any of those table changes require adjustments to how you want to archive or compress. Okay. Otherwise, our system will just simply copy data from one side to the other. As long as the fields exist on both sides, you're fine. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Some of our clients also choose to approach the archive in a slightly different way, and that is, once again, at the start, you may choose to take your data and move it over to an archive data, and then at the end of year 1, what you might actually choose to do is create another database and move that data into a separate database, and so on, so that at the end of year 2, you may also choose to move that into another database and store it that way. Some of our clients like to do this because perhaps maybe after a legal compliance period, they will just drop the data that's older than X number of years. Okay, so we have some clients who also choose to approach their archiving this way. All right, so great. Now that hopefully you understand how the data is moving in the database, what does an actual project look like for archiving? So typically the way this works is we take the projects and we break it up into 3 parts. The first part is what we call an assessment project. The assessment project is basically to take a look at your production environment. Okay, so we would typically come in. This is a fixed price project, and it's usually it's fairly inexpensive. And the idea here is for us to look at your production environment. It's actually a copy of your production environment, and we run a number of tools against that copy of production in order to understand what do we think we can compress and how much better can we get the database down to in terms of size, right? So basically anything in that assessment project that you see in the blue, we do, and in red, you as a client would basically decide at the end of it, when we give you this Excel spreadsheet and our summary analysis of what we think we can do with your system, you would then be able to tell us, do you think this is going to add value or not? The good news is, so far for every client that we've done this kind of work for and provided an assessment, nobody has ever said, you know what, doesn't make sense in my scenario. So great news is it seems that everybody has decided that it added value. So then we would go to the next step, which is a configuration project. So in a configuration project, which is time and material, and also buying the tools on subscription basis, we would first of all go through a configure phase. So you as a client would give us a copy of production, and I'll show you in a moment what that looks like. And basically, we would install our tools, and we would start configuring how the archiving and compression would work. And along the way, during the configuration phase, we would ask for additional information. Quite often as we're configuring, we might find additional fields that we think we can compress by, or maybe we might find other pieces of information that we think are pertinent to reporting, and we might make recommendations about how you might want to choose to archive and compress. And therefore, we're looking for feedback as we ask questions. Once we have everything configured, we can now run our scripts and basically archive and compress that test system. At that point, we hand over the systems to you, the client, and you're going to validate that everything works the way that it works. And the other part is think about things like flow fields, right? Summaries like balances on customer cards. Those are all calculated from the ledger entries, right? So you want to make sure that, for example, prior to test, you had a snapshot of, let's say, all of the customer balances, or you had a trial balance of all of your GL accounts, right? All the balances on your GL accounts are also calculated based on ledger entries. So you want to make sure everything matches to what the original system had. And also run reports, processes, functions, anything that you think might be affected by the fact that records have been removed. Okay. And at the end of the test phase, you would basically decide, okay, did this make sense? Did it all work? And once again, the great news is we've never had a client come back and say that this didn't make sense and it didn't work for them. So at the end of it, basically then we would say, okay, do we want to now apply this to production? And now we move to a deployment project. Now, the deployment project is going to depend on what happens during test. And it can be any scenario from, for example, we, and in conjunction here with Innovia, doing work on your behalf to actually deploy. Perhaps you as a client might say, you know what, I don't really feel comfortable with this process. I'd rather that you do everything from soup to nuts and take care of everything and plan it all out. We can definitely do that. Or we also have clients who say, you know what, after we've done our testing, we really get what you've done with the tools and how you configured it, and we feel pretty comfortable in doing this ourselves. So the other extreme is we do nothing with deployment, and you as a client have chosen to implement it yourselves. Basically, you would just simply take the configured scripts out of the configuration project and you just apply it to production. Honestly, it's potentially that simple, right? But it can be anywhere between those two extremes for deployment project where it's all us or it's all you. And we've had anything in between, including providing training or additional support, or potentially ourselves or Innovia perhaps being available as online support as needed. Any of those scenarios are possible. Okay, so now that you hopefully understand how we approach the project, let's go a little deeper dive so that you can see what that looks like. Okay, so the assessment project basically, just to recap, looks like this. Basically, we take your production database, or sorry, you would, as the client, you would basically take your production database, do a backup of it, and then you would give us a test copy of it. We would have access to it remotely. We would, again, run our tools and scripts against that test database in order to analyze it to get a rough idea of what can we do with it. And from that, we create an Excel spreadsheet and we give it back to you, and then we can have a follow-up meeting to show you what we think we can do with your system. And I said this is all fixed price so that it's meant to be inexpensive so that you can see, you know, what can be possible in your environment. Next, assuming that the assessment project was fine and you feel good about moving forward, now we move to the configuration project. Now, I know this looks like a lot of stuff, but it's actually a little simpler than you might think. So let me walk through it so that you understand how this process works. We would take, I'll rephrase, you will take the production database, make a backup of it. And then what we would like you to do is create 3 copies of it in a test environment. And if you don't have the hardware or infrastructure possible, we can also help you requisition more environments. We've had some clients who have reached out to us and said, you know, I simply don't have the disk space or the SQL Server capacity. So we've also helped them spin up things like Azure and Azure SQL and do this online. So there's a lot of different options on how this might be possible. In any case, we expect 3 copies of production. Okay, so what I want you to focus now is on the bottom row. Okay, the bottom scenario. So we have here what we call UAT archive. By the way, I should very quickly call out the 3 copies. We have one called UAT copy at the top. We have one called UAT live and UAT archive. Okay, so these 3 are exact copies of production. Now, what we do with UAT archive is we will take that SQL Server database and we will actually delete all the data out of it. So you're going to be left with basically an empty shell. Okay, so why do we do that? It's because this is going to be a container for that archive database, and it has to very closely match what the production database is set up like. So we found this was the easiest way to set up the archive database in order to ensure that it has exactly the same parameters as production, okay, versus yes, we could create that UAT archive database from scratch, and then we have to make sure that we configure every parameter to match. But in order to minimize risk, we find that this is the easiest way to simply make a copy of production and delete all the data out of it, and therefore it's ready to go. Okay, so at that point, let's stop at this middle step here where we've created the metadata shell. Let's go back to this UAT live. So this is now a copy of production. And what we do now with this UAT live is we take that assessment report, remember that Excel spreadsheet, and we take that as starting data in order to go and configure our scripts. Remember, all our scripts run on SQL Server side, and they're all configurations of SQL Server scripts. And we set it all up based on information from the assessment report and from input from you as we have more questions. And once we have everything configured, we will run the templates. And when the templates run, it basically takes that UAT live data and basically creates a UAT live with trimmed and compressed data, and also moves that raw data over to the archive database. So by running that template, we're done, okay? At this point, we move into test phase, and this is where we hand over the 3 UAT copies for you to test. So now you have a UAT copy, which is a snapshot of production, okay, for reference. So you can look at all the things like trial balances, customer balances, all that kind of stuff. And you can compare the UAT live, whoops, sorry, I'll go back there, sorry. You can compare that UAT live to make sure that everything looks and behaves like the UAT copy, okay? And then you can, if you like, look at UAT archive, all right? So assuming that you're happy with this, and by the way, I'm already presuming that people are going to have questions about reporting and how do we get to data in the archive database. I'll get to that in a moment, okay? So I promise you we'll talk about that for sure. Okay, so let's assume that you're happy with UAT live compared to UAT copy, and now you're ready to apply it to production. So now you're ready to deploy. So what does a deployment project look like? Well, again, you would take that production database, you would take a backup and restore an archive copy of it. You delete all that data out of that archive database, right? Similar to what we did in the configuration phase. Okay, so now you have an empty shell. Remember those templates that we perfected in the configuration phase? You would simply bring those over here. You would have to repoint them away from the UAT live database and point them to production instead. And now you run the templates. And because it's all configured, once again, it will now trim and compress production and move that data over to the archive database. So that's, as I said, it's just simply taking that set of templates once they've been configured, and you have to change the pointers a little bit in terms of the source database, but at that point, everything should be configured, and because you've already gone through the test phase, you can run it. Okay, now a couple things actually while I talk about this, and I have it in my head. First off, we've run into situations where clients have extremely large databases. So we're talking about multiple terabytes, okay, up to or greater than 10 even terabytes. And as you can imagine, running these templates, even trying to do this over a weekend, trying to do it on an entire database might not finish. It's just simply way too much data, okay? Now, here's what's neat. What's neat about this is nobody says that you have to run our templates across the entire database at once. What do I mean by that? Well, what you can do is one weekend, you can do your GL entry because it creates trimmed and compressed records for GL entry. All of your GL entry will be correct after that weekend, okay? And maybe the following weekend, you run your customer ledger entries. And maybe the weekend after that, you run your item ledger entries. So you can deploy the templates over time. You don't have to run it all at once, okay? So that way you can actually continue to work after each weekend and still have full data consistency from before the weekend to after the weekend. Okay, so that's another really neat thing about these tools. Don't have to run them all at once. You can run them in bits and pieces as needed, and therefore you can transition your database from a huge one to a smaller one. I talked a little bit about data, and people might be thinking, well, what about, I want to run reports and I also want to get data from my archive. So there's a whole bunch of different things that you can do. And again, we can talk about all the different possibilities, but there's quite a few. So the simplest one is if you're doing external reporting, as an example, let's say pulling out of production SQL Server, you would just simply have to change your queries how you get the data. Instead of pointing to just your production database, you would have to do a join and also point to archive so that you pull data out of 2 locations instead of 1. Okay, so doing a join is one way. We also have clients who want some of that archive data visible in production. So what some clients will do is actually put in linked tables in production so that the archive data will also show up in production. So that's another way that you could do it. Okay, and so on. There's actually many different ways that you can get that archive data to show up in the production system and also to be able to show up in other applications and reports. Okay, so not difficult, all doable. The other thing is, because the archive database sits in SQL Server and it's built on top of NAV table structures, if you also bring over some of the base setup data from production, like things like security and a few other things, you can actually have end users go to the archive database with the NAV client. So you could point to production, look in production, and then if you want to look at the detail, repoint your client to archive, and you can see it. Of course, the only other thing I would recommend in that case is that every user has read-only in archive, but we have a lot of clients who just simply use their NAV clients to point to each one of those different databases in order to look at what's there. Okay, so having said all that, let's dig into what we started with. So the NAV Data Lifecycle. So once again, you can create your data to begin with, and operationally, you'll use that on a day-to-day basis. For reference data, some of this historical data, you may choose to compress some of it in your live database, and you can move some of it into archive. If you truly want to archive the data, then go ahead, archive it by moving it to the archive database and then delete it out of your live database. Okay, so it's still all there. It's just you've reduced the size of your production. And then finally, when you want to discard, in our case, we don't discard. In reality, we're just simply moving it into the archive database and removing it from production. But in fact, it's always there for reference purposes, so you don't actually lose any of that data.
Thank you so much, Floyd, for showcasing the tools, the methodology, and the process for keeping a more trim and operationally focused production database from a data size perspective. If you're interested in more information and digging a little deeper into archiving and compressing your NAV solution, please feel free to reach out to me at ndetmer@kixas.com. That's NDETMER at QIXAS.com. I hope you all had a fantastic session. You learned a little bit, and we hope to hear back from you soon with feedback or any questions that you may have. Please feel free to reach out at any time. Have a great day. Bye.